the Radio Forest podcast.
I'm fine. How's yourself?
Doing pretty good. We're here to talk about The Last Great Dream, your book that came out this year. You're in the Bay Area now, right?
Yeah, I live in San Francisco.
But that's not where you started. You're more of an East Coast kid, but also spent some time overseas. So kind of fill me in on the beginning of your life and where you kind of started out during the Bohemian and hippie movement. Where were you?
Far, far away, which is why I think I've spent the last 50 years researching various aspects of it, the Kerouac and the Grateful Dead and other things. I was a military brat, Army brat, and grew up in Germany and around the United States in various places. And then my father, after he retired, I was 13, he became a Unitarian minister. So we moved to Maine, where he went to school for that. And as you say, I was on the East Coast and went to college in New York and graduate school in Massachusetts. And as you say, in 1967, the spring of 1967, I actually have a real memory of being in the public library in Dexter, Maine, looking at Life magazine and seeing pictures of Jerry Garcia in an Uncle Sam hat and all about the be-in. And I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting, but I did not have a clue as to how much of my life it would become.
Did you feel a little bit removed because you're on the East Coast and, San Francisco and the Bay Area is kind of always associated with the hippie movement of the late 60s, but you also have the Village in New York. So were you kind of aware of both scenes at the same time, or did one kind of transform into another?
I knew a little bit about New York, and I went to New York. By the time I got to graduate school, I was going to New York fairly regularly. But the New York is, how do I put it? New York is great for Greenwich Village is great for challenging, conventional lifestyle. And my book is a lot about is not only San Francisco but New York and Los Angeles and London, all of which comes together at the Monterey Pop Festival, and that's the arc of the book, and it sort of touches on almost everything in between. But New York was important, but it's not designed. When you come to San Francisco, and even if you're standing on Haight Street, which is a busy urban street, you can look down the end of the street and you see all of Golden Gate Park. You can see, not far away at all, Mount Tam, which is this beautiful mountain that sort of looms over San Francisco, and it has an access to nature. One of the reasons why, at least it's my theory, that these things happen in San Francisco, there were two. One, of course, is that there's a connection in nature that's really unique in American cities, maybe Seattle, but generally it's got a certain beauty, physical nature beauty to it that most cities, you're in a city. And the other thing is that unlike most cities, which start for business reasons, San Francisco got started by a bunch of crazed sort of failures, people who lived on the East Coast or in Chile or in China, who risked their necks and their lives to chase gold. So instead of being, sort of hardworking, well, they worked hard, but you know what I mean, they're sort of well-behaved. They were not so well-behaved. They were a little loose. And that left San Francisco with a tradition of tolerance for craziness that is kind of unique.
Now, you talk about Haight-Ashbury, and I've visited several times, and I'm looking for these iconic places and storefronts that, were home of The Doors and Janis Joplin and Buffalo Springfield. Who else? What are some of the other bands with that area in San Francisco that were the beginning of a movement, which at the time they didn't realize it? They're just kind of all these, I don't want to call them small town bands, but they were accessible, right? They weren't these huge arena stars yet.
Oh, good God, no. I mean, the Fillmore Auditorium was the big room, and that was 1,200 seats. And in fact, almost all these bands played in the Matrix, which was a pizza joint of about 120, maybe 120 seats, or room for 120 standing. You have the Grateful Dead, of course, and the Grateful Dead are perhaps more famous than the others, mostly because they're the last band standing. They sort of took on all, they became connected with all the values of the Haight, which was peace and, sexual freedom and kindness and all this good stuff. And for various reasons, not least because Jerry Garcia was a really smart leader, mostly because he wouldn't lead. He just sort of dragged everybody along with him. You had, in fact, the much more popular band, Jefferson Airplane. They could sing, and they were good songs and they had hits. And in the earliest days, they were by far the most popular band. And you had Quicksilver Messenger Service. What they all were former folk musicians, almost all folk musicians that then heard the Beatles, like everybody else, and transformed their lives with psychedelics. And the end result was what they called the San Francisco Sound, which was connected, not always correctly, because the Airplane kind of jammed, but was not there to improvise the way the Grateful Dead or Quicksilver were. But there was this sound of exploration, cosmic exploration, and that included Country Joe and the Fish, for instance, all the way over there in Berkeley. So it was a very distinctive kind of music, and it carried with it a message of freedom and of positivity, and it stood for what I came to call the last great dream.
You also wrote a book, A Long Strange Trip, about the Grateful Dead. So just a quick question. You mentioned Garcia. I've always wondered, how did it become that he's the sort of leader of the band and it wasn't Bob Weir? The guitar player isn't usually the leader, right? It's usually the lead singer.
Well, actually, Jerry sang at least as much as Bobby, but it had to do with the fact that when they started, Bobby was 17 and Jerry was 23. And it's only 5 years or 6 years difference, but at that age, it's quite a lot of difference. And Jerry had what nowadays we call an EQ, an emotional quotient, which is to say, his people glommed onto him. You can call it charisma. Part of it was just he was interested in other people. Bobby, was younger and just sort of more kind of adventurous. But as I say, people, and people liked him, of course. But Jerry just was a natural leader. Again, not by bossing people around, but by simply making decisions that everybody went, yeah, right, that's what we should do. It was, it was the reverse, where you have George Harrison complaining about, songs with Lennon and McCartney and Bill Wyman with the Stones. Jerry, in fact, the reverse, he would harass Bobby, who was kind of streaky about songwriting, but he would really, push him to write more songs, thinking that the band would be more interesting with more input. So, he was the reverse of the guy that, I'll do the songwriting, I'll make the money, Roger Daltrey's complaints about Pete Townsend.
So tell me about meeting Garcia, though, and was hanging out with him. Is that ever separate from the psychedelics and the drugs, or was that always a part of the Garcia mystique?
Oh, always. I mean, Jerry never thought of himself as a hippie. He thought of himself as a latter-day beatnik. And that's because when he was like 16, he was taking art classes from a guy named Wally Hedrick. Wally Hedrick was very much prominent part of the beat scene in painting, or in his case, assemblage art, in San Francisco. And this is 1958. And among other things, he was playing acoustic blues while they were painting. And I'll repeat, Jerry was 16. And that's what made him say, I want a guitar. So Wally had some impact on Jerry's life. The other thing was that Jerry and his buddy, who were taking the class, said, what is this beat thing? Because it was, front page news at the time. On the Road was on the bestseller list. And Wally said, you guys are beat. You should go down to City Lights and get this book, On the Road. And Jerry did. And it was his Bible for the rest of his life. I became involved with him because I had written a book about Kerouac called Desolate Angel. and sent it to him. And eventually I met him and mentioned the book, and he went, "Oh yeah, you're the guy. Oh, okay." And a little while later he said, "Why don't you do us?" So there was it wasn't just that On the Road was his Bible, but remember the lead guy in On the Road is a guy fictitiously named Dean Moriarty, whose real name was Neil Cassidy. And Bob Weir wrote a song called The Other One, in which Neil is Cowboy Neil at the wheel. So they knew him for real, and it made a lot of sense. So that's the transition of culture.
I want to ask you a personal question. Feel free to answer this any way you want. I'm not. I'm prying because I'm such a fan of the music and the era, and like I said, the mystique of the Grateful Dead mostly. But did you ever do drugs with the Grateful Dead members? And second question, what do you think's the highest you've ever been?
The answer is yes. I never did drugs, psychedelic drugs with members of the Grateful Dead, except when they were on stage. Even when by the time I worked with them, it was like I couldn't do drugs anymore.
Yeah.
Hey, I had to be sentient and make sure that reporters got treated properly and whatnot. And so no, but the highest I ever was probably. Let's put it this way. It was called window pane acid, and I was in the shotgun seat. We were driving, and I was so high that I couldn't. The motion of oncoming, just whatever you saw from the car in movement was too much, and I was like staring at the floor. But it was fun.
Your book, you kind of touched on this too, it kind of heads to the Monterey Pop Festival in 1968. So you've got Hendrix, Joplin, The Who, a lot of the performers that end up at Woodstock a year later. So can you kind of tell me about that festival and the impact it had on the social setting of the U.S. and also the music scene?
Well, Monterey Pop began ultimately, the Newport Jazz Festival began festivals, people coming together from many bands. But for rock and roll, it was Monterey Pop that brought all these together. There was a second or third row, which is the VIP row, and every major executive for the coming years, Clive Davis and the people at Warner Brothers, and all of them would see what happened at Monterey, and would hire bands or retain bands, put them on their labels as a result of what they saw. It had begun as simply there were so-called riots. They weren't riots. They were police running around waving batons at kids sitting in the street. But they were called the Sunset Strip riots, and this was originally to sort of combat that misinformation. Some stuff stays with us. But they ended up deciding it was going to be asking bands to make it a nonprofit, and it was a celebration of the psychedelic. The whole ethos of the spring of '67 was, wear flowers and come hang out, and that's exactly what happened at Monterey. For 4 days, the whole image of young people, beautiful young people with flowers in their hair and beads around their neck, listening to great music and sort of idyllically high and peaceful, was reality. It really, it was remarkable. There were thousands more people than the capacity of the arena, and it was okay. And that's considering all of the various crowd control problems that the Grateful Dead later had, many years later. That was magical, and it brought in England with Jimi Hendrix and the Who. You had the Electric Flag from New York. You had the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield from L.A., and you had the Airplane and the Dead, and of course the one that nobody outside of San Francisco had a clue about was Janis Joplin, who just stole the show. And there's a long story, but they weren't filmed the first time. was politics. They didn't trust the L.A. Sharks, and what happened was the filmmaker, Pennebaker, just went to them and said, "That was the most brilliant thing I ever saw. You have to be in the movie." And eventually they said, "Okay, we'll be in the movie." And you see it, you see that there as just one of the most amazing performances anybody ever did. And that doesn't even mention Otis Redding, by the way.
Author Dennis McNally, The Last Great Dream is the book, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the Sixties. So last question, can you kind of tell me what's the difference between a bohemian and a hippie? Isn't a hippie a bohemian, or are they different?
Well, it's an evolution. So you start, actually you can go all the way back to free thinkers like Henry Thoreau and Walt Whitman, and watch things evolve. But the hippie was just of its time. It was a conscious choice to step out of conventional thinking, frequently assisted by psychedelic experiences, and try and live a less materialistic, more peaceful life. And even though it didn't, the phenomenon in the Haight-Ashbury didn't last very long, those values went out into American culture, and so that even now today, if you eat vegetarian food or organic food, or work for an environmental, have an environmental conscience, or support LGBT rights, you're affected by the 60s. The values didn't go away.
In that era, the late 60s, would Bob Dylan be considered a bohemian or a hippie, or neither?
He was a bohemian. He was absolutely a bohemian. He was very influenced, as was Jerry. All of the early 60s, people that we think of as Dylan and Janis Joplin and Jerry Garcia and David Bowie and whatnot, all of them are important, were deeply influenced by the Beats. So they're the next step. Dylan did experience psychedelics, and it had a huge impact on his writing. So, but there's just one of the essential elements of hippie is sort of nonviolent gentleness, and that Dylan. Not that I'm aware of Dylan ever getting any fistfights, but he had a much sharper take on things, and a much more critical one. So I don't think of him as a hippie, no.
Well, I love the book, The Last Great Dream. It's author Dennis McNally. He also has A Long Strange Trip about the Grateful Dead and quite a few other books. So, hey, Dennis, I really appreciate the chat today, and I love the book. Thank you for the call.
Thank you for liking it. Take care.